computer. I'll keep it. Oh, shoot. Defroze. Okay, there you go. So if I recall, the thing that initiated us deciding to talk to each other was a conversation around, well, I guess my tweet on ideology. And maybe it's useful to go down that path, although I don't have any particular attachment to it. My general sense is that given that kind of symmetric or conversation is actually quite scarce, you should use your conversation time as wisely as possible. So if there's actually a more meaningful thing for us to talk about, we should go there. But maybe we can use that as an entree, unless you've already got a better place for us to go.
Yeah. So the way of saying, like, let's escape ideology is sort of the most ideological claim that you can make, is my understanding of it. So that's coming from like solidly from Zizek, or like, taking the red pill. In that sense, is possibly the most ideological thing that you can do. How is that most ideologic? Now, again, going back to Zizek, because like he's definitely the guy I would go to if I want to like think about ideology in many ways. And his film Pervert's Guide to Ideology is something I'd recommend that you check out. It's very entertaining, and I think I also got the Coca-Cola can metaphor from there. Like, I guess something new that is used to describe ideology is Pokemon Go is a good example. It's a lens through which you're viewing the world. And now you're not just seeing the world per se, you're also seeing possibility of Pokemon into your world. And that is a way of structuring a desire. People are getting out to walk. People are, going out of their way to different areas to find Pokemon. And that is the ideological lens to him. It's a lens. It's a lens that you can put on, and it gives meaning to the world through which you are now interacting and interfacing with it in a different way. So there is no escaping ideology in that sense, because without to be born naked into the world without any sort of structuring in that sense is you do not have anything to make sense of the world with. Is so, at least for us mimetic animals, I learn what I need to do, what I should desire from other things. Film being one of the most, powerful teachers of desire and structuring tools to our modern world. And so in that sense, when you say escape from ideology, I understand what you're saying. It's the dragons of ideology when it comes to like politics or when it comes to religion. They come with massive cages, massively detailed, this thing that really does make people unable to think outside of this. So I get the criticism, or like what when you say like, let's take off the glasses and let's live without ideology. But I guess the nuanced take on it, or like I guess the lot of like reaction that you got from it, like the quick knee-jerk reaction that one was giving was from that, like, this ideology critique thing is quite interesting to a lot of people in like, politics and stuff like that. So they've jumped into it, and they've heard probably Sisek talk about how you can't live without ideology and stuff like that. So I guess the knee-jerk reaction would be coming from that. They would be calling you a fool for thinking, yeah, that's not possible, bro. That's the frame that they're probably coming at it from. Whereas for me, ideology is definitely something you can like critique. Like it's about knowing that you're wearing glasses, or knowing very clearly that you are looking at the world through Pokemon Go, and then swapping those lenses around, as opposed to there's no attempt to escape from any sort of lens.
So there's there's a bunch. So let me just sort of caveat first. I have no particular experience of Zizek. So I've maybe read literally a couple of pages and maybe watched, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 minutes. And my basic sense was, this is not for me. There was something about the something about the nature of how he was coming at the inquiry that caused me to feel that it was not something that I was interested in delving into more deeply. And to be honest, that doesn't happen that often, although it was intriguing to me that you actually mentioned Lacan in the same breath, because Lacan's another example of that. I actually explored Lacan somewhat deeply 30 years ago. But my basic takeaway was, this is not for me, like almost like a sense of having maybe been offered a food by somebody, eaten it, and then gone, actually, this tastes like it might actually be toxic. So I better get it out of my system. Zizek is feeling more in the direction of almost like, for me, seductive grifting that is highly skilled. But again, I can't speak to that at all, since I've encountered it very lightly. So FYI, I don't have a shared reference point is the key point. In terms of the notion of reaction or knee-jerk reaction, what I was noticing is that it's this is probably why the word ideologue typically carries a negative connotation. Right? One could choose to identify the word ideologue as meaning somebody who's sort of carefully, like in the Simpsons, is like biologist, right? Biologist does not carry a negative connotation. And a person who endeavors an orderly study of life, biology. To the degree that an ideologue is somebody who endeavors an orderly study of ideas, for example, that would be a neutral. And yet the term typically carries a negative connotation. And I suspect there's actually something deep to that. And that whatever that deep is most likely the primary driver for why people's response to my tweet was, in fact, as you say, knee-jerk or reactive, meaning not particularly considerate, and by meaning not considering in any particular way. And I think that actually gives us a little bit of a thread to teasing the meaning of the thing that is sometimes called ideology, right? And so now we have to get to be careful about the fact that when we want to make a strong statement that ideology is, what we're doing, of course, is engaging in some kind of, in the sort of Foucauldian sense, a power move of endeavoring to oppress particular ideology, or in this case, I'll use a simpler word, a particular frame. Right? So, okay, within a particular frame, I've identified one of the manifold experiences of life with the signifier ideology, and I would like you to use it to mean the same thing. Right? In this case, I'm proposing that there's, in the kind of experience of humanity, a wide variety of different qualities of reality that have been identified with the signifier ideology, which is to say that it's not even vaguely called a settled matter, particularly these days, right? In an environment where the fragmentation of common knowledge, when I would propose, for example, driven by the fact that digital network technology has enabled a much larger or a different quality of how communication works, has driven almost all common knowledge into the chaos. Right? I think an example I used was somebody I was talking to, that we live in a world where things like 2 + 2 = 4, and the nature of the meaning of the term woman is highly problematized. So it seems very unlikely that the word ideology is not even more problematized. So, okay, so fair enough. So what we're trying to do then is to say, okay, what exactly are we talking about? All right, so this notion of, hold on, let me get this metaphor of Pokemon Go. This is nice. And there's, I think, roughly 3 sorts of nuances. One nuance, you use the term, and I liked it, it was very nice, almost like a metaphorical or mythological, the dragons of ideology. And here I want to be precise. And what I mean is, and I actually use this also in some other conversations, something like an addictive ideology, meaning a frame, a lens, which has as one of its characteristics, and I don't necessarily mean this by design, but probabilistically, that one loses oneself in the lens and begins to take the lens as actually being without a lens, reality itself. And we can think of like examples of this. These would be examples where one takes the evaluations, truth and or good evaluations of the ideology as primary to, for example, your own experience, right? So this would be there are 5 lights, or there are 4 lights, whatever the particular is, right? I see 4 lights, or I see 3 lights. The ideology tells me that there's 4 lights. If I say there's 4 lights, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about when we say the dragon of ideology. So that I think we can relatively, we're sort of, okay, we're going to identify something with a little bit more context and then attach a label to it. I typically would refer to the thing we're calling the dragon of ideology as ideology per se. And then I would use something like frame or model or perspective to mean the more sort of pervasive universal thing. Okay, fair enough. So let's see. But I think and I think it's not particularly controversial, although my point is that it's more controversial than it should be, that if you were to restate my tweet as, remember that we can live without living through the dragon of ideology or these kinds of addictive ideologies, that it's possible to live outside of addictive ideologies. And it's really important that we actually do that. I would imagine that would be relatively non-controversial. However, I would also point out that it's more controversial than it should be, which is why I thought it was worth saying. So that's kind of like, I'm almost seeing a visual like hierarchy. So there's something relatively trivial, but useful to be talked about at that level. And then we can also go down to what I think is a deeper level, which has to do with the question of the relationship between, let's call it for the moment, perspective or frame, and the obligatory nature of sense making by means of frame at all, right? So the kind of the stronger term, like if I take that to mean ideology, and what I'm sort of assuming or accepting as the Zizekian sense, that's actually a deeper question. I think it's actually quite interesting to inquire. So can I ask you a question? Would you say, would you say that Zizek would say, or more, if you wish to just sort of throw that away, would you say that standing up, like learning how to go from a being that can't stand to a being that can stand, is ideological?
Interesting. So the first thought that came into my mind is like Tarzan. He does not, like, I mean, at least the Mowgli character from Jungle Book doesn't stand upright and is usually so shown like hunched around, walking around because he's grew up around chimpanzees. So
okay,
that's the first thing that comes to my mind. Of course, that's not a scientific study; that's an animated movie. But
we can be quite clear. There's no question that the particulars of how a given individual actually frames their body posture as they're moving through space definitely is different in different cultures. That's for sure. Okay. And I'm specifically focusing on the general function of to move from being a child that can't stand to one that can stand at all. And maybe we can hold off on a moment on the details of how one goes about standing in particular. And that's a very important thing to look at, right? So those are two distinct things. So would you say that learning how to stand is ideological?
No.
Okay.
Not ideological.
I agree with you. And now we have a very interesting, like a beginning to build out a vocabulary to start having what I would consider to be more interesting conversations.
So I would say no, because like when on the tweet itself, when I said when you asked me, does a rock have ideology? Does a tree have ideology? I said genetic in quotes, ideology maybe for the tree, and chemical maybe for the rock, right? So I think so. I'm reducing down the definition of ideology back to mimetic. Whatever can you like capture by meme? So like if I'm standing upright, chest like this because that's more masculine, yeah, projects more confidence. That can probably be ideological, but the motor function of standing up because it's more efficient with our body design, possibly not mimetic, right? So that I see. And what I find interesting, where like you wanted to restrict the usage of the term ideology to the dragons specifically.
That's the way I use
Yeah.
it, and the received kind of lineage of the culture that I've been part of. It's used that way, but I don't have a particular need to do so. It's just useful in communication to know what we're talking about.
Yeah. and which is where a lot of people read your tweet from, right? You meant specifically the addictive ideologies that which we need to escape from in that sense. And for me, ideology critique or going down that path has been a valuable psychotechnology in that sense. And because of that, I just for the branding the psychotechnology there with the word ideology, I would not like to restrict it to the addictive ones. I would rather it be more open, so that again that's ideology on my part, so that people are more aware of what they're looking at. They don't think, hey, they have ideology, I do not. I think it would be much more valuable if ideology is much more open, because you would be more prone to looking for ideology in your thoughts and the way you do things and what you find valuable.
Aha. Okay. So there's a bunch there. So the first, it seems that there's a simple piece, which I've been calling the rectification of names, which is referring it to what I understand from the Chinese.
Mhm.
Or we could just be more clear or simpler. Disambiguation is useful, or the Tower of Babel problem, right?
Yeah.
Clearly, if we find ourselves in an environment where nobody has any real shared sense of what a given semantic signifier word means, then it's very difficult to engage in any real conversation. So it's useful, although, by the way, in the context of the cultural transformation we're going through, it may in fact not be achievable in the immediate term. But it's useful to have, by the way, that last little aside is actually quite important. But we can pause for a moment or pin that for later. It's certainly useful, like what we're doing right now in this conversation, is to engage in a high context disambiguation, and then be able to then sort of establish labels that allows us to start simplifying the conversation by saying, okay, I know now when you say ideology what you mean, and you know when I say ideology what I mean, and we're going to make some agreements in the context of this particular context for simplification purposes. Super agreed. Okay, now the second, I also agree that there's something really important going on in terms of the structuring of how mind makes sense and values its experiences that needs to be considered deeply. There's no question about that. And we were using a very nice example. I think maybe we can keep using the example of standing. But it's important to recognize that the particular, how do you say, style with which one stands or walks, maybe walking is a little bit more clean, is not even vaguely perfectly neutral. Right? It's not a perfectly functional thing. As one walks, there are many, many characteristics that, for example, are going to be a result of something that we're, for the moment, I'm put quotes around it, that are culturally conditioned. And it's useful. It's like really important to actually be able to investigate that and be able to start taking a look at what those characteristics are. It's not clear to me that the word ideology is going to prove to be a useful word in this term, given the actual sort of complexity and its history. I mean, we know it actually is. It was labeled. Right? It was originally neologized in the context of the French Revolution, which is it was not born in simplicity. Right? It was already born in a high potency location in terms of the psycho-social, cultural conflicts, which are still playing out to this day. Okay, so it feels almost like the kind of thing that wants to be struggled over, but that doesn't matter to me. Like I can certainly participate. Just FYI, like from a branding perspective, it's not likely to be a low conflict brand. It just doesn't happen. It's very unlikely. Okay, so then, great. So we can dispense with that, I think, for the moment. And there's almost like three, how would I say, like domains of what would be called like constraints on choice, maybe is the right way of describing it. At least three, and there's maybe more. I'm noticing three that would be playing a role in how one would go about walking through a space. As I'm replacing standing with walking because it just seems like an easier example. One, we could talk about as being kind of the bounded by, well, we can actually, I think this could be quite precise, bounded by the constraints of physics, chemistry, and biology. So a human, being a human that has 2 legs with the structure of musculature and bones that we happen to have in the context of how muscle contractions can work and how neurons can move things and how physics constrains behavior, including things like friction and everything else, there's going to be a very particular subset of possible ways that that kind of biological organism can process the function of walking through space. None of which is identified as by the category or the term that we've used, ideology, in the Zizekian sense. I'll from now may refer to as Z ideology or Zideology, just to make it simple to say. Does that seem right? Like that feels like a very important thing to notice, that that's actually true, and then, okay, kind of have that be part of our toolkit for thinking about reality. And then the second and the third are very subtle. Like you have to actually, I think, be quite careful. The second would be something like I would call it's funny, I'll use biological terms for the moment, a hominid level, interpersonal selection function that is not expressed and cannot be expressed or need not be expressed in language. So chimps understand very cleanly different body postures as signaling mechanisms in the context of the sort of sociological or the interpersonal dynamics of a troop of chimps. Yeah. And will select their particular body postures as a consequence. And noticing this is also sitting on top of the biological strata. So and then by the way, I'm sure that this is the kind of thing that causes red flags, but as Jordan Peterson somewhat famously pointed out, right, very old structures like serotonin feedback loops that are deeply predate Homo sapiens have a very profound feedback on body posture. And so organisms that have high degrees of serotonin will in fact have a higher verticality of and directness, by the way, more energy put into directness of motion, less hesitancy, for very straightforward physical, evolutionary, call it fitness reasons, having nothing to do with any plan. There's no particular like feedback loop deliberation. So we've got mimicking. You know, obviously, if you're simply noticing different styles, simple mimicking, like nothing other than simple mimicking. We've seen, for example, that if you take a child, a very small child, like a 2-month-old, and you put an adult in the room and the adult takes a hat and puts it on upside down, the child will put the hat on their head upside down, right? This appears to be a very basic human thing. Like we just mimic, which makes a lot of sense, right? Most likely adult behavior is not random, and selecting adult behavior without any filter is a pretty good way to shortcut searching through all possible ways of doing things. Again, at just basic survival levels. And of course, then we begin to get into the very nuanced things of the fact that we're social animals. So if I walk in a particular way, there's a very distinct physical felt sense of aversion and attraction, potential threat, potential invitation, potential actual violence, like all kinds of things that are going on that are happening at what I'll call kind of the hominid level. And yes, this is also super true, and will produce a wide variety of distinct selection functions, i.e. different cultures will intrinsically create almost like attractor fields or how would you say this? Constraint fields, like constraints on how one can express the larger field of possibility of to walk or to stand by those boundaries. And those boundaries are going to be social. And if you'd like, we could call them cultural, but we have to be very careful what we mean by that. Then the third kind is the kind that has to do with expressed norms, right? Stand up straighter. Somebody is actually, there are norms that are spread through the social environment in a way that specifically can be expressed, or at least, yes, can be expressed, and quite often, in fact, have been expressed, although not necessarily recently. They may have actually been expressed 50 generations ago, and then have gotten hardened into that second layer. So we don't notice. They're not in the Santa Fe Institute. They would call these frozen accidents. In this case, they're not accidents, but they're frozen. So they've removed from the third layer of things that are expressed in language into the second layer, the things that are expressed in behavior, but somewhat arbitrarily. I mean, they're not obviously or necessarily part of the second layer. They were produced at the third layer. Okay, so again, to kind of, I would typically.
Could you give me an example of expressed norms?
Sure. A young lady should always cross her legs when she sits. Let me think. I'm wanting to find examples that are not perfectly, like they're right in the sweet spot between the second and the third layer. Like they actually are of the third layer, but actually play nicely with the second layer. I mean, the one that comes to my mind most specifically is the shoulders back, chest out biomorphism that, as I understand, was originally, at least in the West, promulgated through Prussia. So we actually have we can actually point to a location where it was actually identified as the thing and then propagated out through a series of cultural expressions, most notably the Prussians winning military conflicts and other groups saying, I guess I better adopt whatever the fuck they're doing because they're winning, something like that. And notice there's some really interesting feedback loops there, because on the one hand, there's something happening at the first layer, which is a very deep layer, where human beings and hominids and lobsters that have a felt sense of success, meaning they are actually being successful and they perceive that properly, will tend to assume certain body postures. And then when I get to the third layer, there's ways of reifying that, where I can assume this body posture, even literally in a self-help book that says, hey, if you stand up straight with your shoulders back, everybody will think you're a winner. And we get this weird loop, right? Where now I'm actually feeding the third into the first, but I'm actually now beginning to game or jam the actual first by making it something that's actually being played with at the cultural level. And then I guess we could actually now speak of a fourth level, which I think is perhaps to the point of my actual, the deepest point of my actual tweet, would be something like the artistic, where the actual individual human is choosing a body posture as a cultural creative, not merely as a cultural receiver. And now we're getting to the absolute essence of, I think, where the conversation has its most potent, interesting piece, which is to say, I would propose that cultural creation is a real thing. And that's it's important to get very clear. If one is arguing that one can never escape layer 3 or 2 or 1, and that any act of cultural creation is always an act coming from a fully complete, closed, culturally conditioned expression, then a human being can never actually participate in cultural creation. It is simply standing waves feeding back on standing waves in a closed loop happening at the level of something that is outside of human choice. And I would propose that that's not true. That's not an accurate description of how reality actually is.
There is will in that sense, right?
Yes.
I see what you mean. And this is a really hard question. I think, isn't this what the Matrix movies are about?
This is a very hard question. Yes, it's an extremely hard question. It's not even vaguely not hard. And so, okay. It's what a lot of things are about. And the
Mhm.
Matrix movies, I mean, I think do quite a good job. At least the first one, and I kind of feel like the second one. The third one felt like they're sort of mailing it in. But anyway, that's my
Mhm. Which is where it gets interesting. Like the first one, you could still leave thinking that Neo is the one and he has will. So when you say like artistic production, Neo can be considered as someone who is artistically producing, right? I mean,
yes,
he
that's
has
right.
will.
One might very well conclude at the end of the first Matrix movie, the point is by virtue of dying and by virtue of love, right, which are great mythopoetic pieces of this kind of fabric, he has exited the context of only being a function of the Matrix and to actually being in a relationship of creation in relationship with the Matrix. Yes.
Whereas I haven't seen the other movies. I think I've seen the second one and the third one when I was like really young on DivX, and I didn't really get the point of the second and third movies back then, because the first level of the story, I mean, the first part of the movie, does genuinely give you the idea that yes, you have free will, that you can be the one, and you can be in touch with the source even when you are embedded deep within the matrix. And whereas the second movies and the third movies go on deconstructing that and playing around with that. And uh, I mean, this question, I want to bring it back into like the nature versus nurture, which again, I'm seeing, I feel like we have the problem because we are trying to draw the line between the nature and the nurture. Whereas not seeing it in a non-dualistic sense. We are being dualistic when we're trying to define the difference between nature and nurture. Whether we are in ideology or outside of ideology is the question of that nature versus nurture problem. And even you could say like mind body, right? If mind has will, if mind has true will, and body is something that's configured by like a man standing is all, it's all materialistic factors that lead to him standing upright.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas question of will is what we talk about in mind. I mean, the side of things. And yeah, and this I think yeah, like my problem with like Zizek and like Lacan and all those people like from the starting itself is like I liked reading them. I mean, Zizek was quite interesting to me. Politics and all that when I was getting into it, Zizek was a voice that was out there, and some ideas have stuck like divine violence and stuff like, which I want to get into later actually. But I'm also thinking about like what John Ash is doing, because like we are having these conversations, but I think we're very much aligned in the way we're thinking and in what we value. But we are yet having to make sure that our Tower of Babel plans are matching up, right? By using our words to kind of do this, and in doing that, we need to make sure our words are, we're talking about the same thing. Like when you talked about ideology and like your evaluations or your wisdom about what to do with this kind of stuff, the word itself becomes a problem where people don't see the wisdom, right? They're not able to decode it because we don't have the same codexes. And this is where I really like project that like John Ash is kind of pushing out there, the circle, the where uh, AI can be that translation engine, right? Where are the vectors of my meaning and the vectors of your meaning. I'm imagining the word to vec paradigm for like the language representation, and like king minus queen equal I forget that classic thing, king minus man plus woman is equal to queen, right? Like that kind of vector. Like relationships are similar, the geometries are similar, but our points in space might be different, or our uh, like our vectors might be different, but the operations that we learn when we talk about, okay, these two metaphors are similar between us, I think the geometry in there is same, but we all have different circles. And if an AI has recorded over time what my circles are and what your circles are, and you're speaking French and I'm speaking English, we can still communicate. We can still say, hey, yes, you know what? I get what you mean. I get the geometry of what you mean.
Yes.
And
Yes, this is
that was
that last I was listening very closely, but I don't know exactly why, but at that particular moment there was something that landed like, okay, yes. Oh, that's actually interestingly self-referential. So let's just think about the moment that just occurred. You were talking, you were using words, right? You were carefully trying to select particular words to convey, I'll say meaning. You're trying to convey something. And I was listening, and I was carefully listening, trying to perceive, and by the way, not pre-perceive, right? Not foreclose, but actually, what is he talking about? What is the meaning? And there was a moment where something happened, something like a coordination of orientation to the place from which expression comes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I felt, yes, I understand what it is that you were saying. And by the way, in an interesting piece, it may also, this is a proposal, it may be that when I understand, I also agree. I'm not quite sure about that, but I felt like there's something there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in any event, I understand. Now, that whole thing, like that very notion, that's like super rich to focus on. The notion of what's happening here. For the moment, we can actually ignore the AI piece. We could just talk about just talking in general. That there's something about, and I would say, by the way, FYI, if we want to have the word post-ideological mean anything at all, I believe what we're doing right now is illustrating what post-ideological must mean.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
We're allowing words to play a role, but we're not getting hung up on the role that those words are playing. And we're actually endeavoring to find some way of coordinating our called shared interior or our sense-making capacity to, and you use the word geometry, which I often will use as well, right? To the place or the location from whence expression comes. Right? When I say something, I'm translating something from a pre-linguistic form into, I'm informing it, right? I'm converting it into words in a language that I have some facility in for purposes of communication, right? Going back and forth. But the words are never going to be the thing, right? They're going to be at best something like a vector space that orients our shared, whatever it is that we use as a faculty to get to the thing that is endeavoring to express itself, right? So notice I'm proposing an ontology. I'm proposing an ontology that has something that is expressing itself that is not strictly identified with the words that are being used, not even of the same kind, right? Not even the same quality of reality. And this is what I would propose is the content of what it might be to say post-ideological, or also, by the way, pre-ideological. There's this middle ground where we get stuck forgetting or specifically identifying the words as being the thing itself and losing track of the thing that is non-linguistic, that is expressing itself in words. I would call that, for the moment, I'll just call it paradigmatic mind, just to kind of use a slightly different term. Or ideological in the negative sense, but not strictly identified as the dragons of ideology, right? And this is where it gets very, very subtle. And to the degree to which we are remembering, and I'm not talking about inventing a new thing, but just recovering, it seems obviously the case that when I am expressing myself, there is something that is being expressed that is not strictly identified as being the words, but is rather the thing that conditions which words are selected. And when you and I are communicating, I can listen to what you're saying and I can say things back. And something that's being built up, almost a relationship is being built up that allows us to connect at the level of that which is not strictly the words themselves. Okay, that's a bunch of words that I just threw out.
And see, where is an entry point?
Can I throw out a phrase like the distinction, the notion of a meaningful conversation, and very specifically the distinction between two chatbots, like ChatGPT chatting with ChatGPT, and two humans, as maybe examples of the distinction between a meaningless conversation, where communication in the most abstract or most superficial sense is occurring, and a meaningful conversation, where the thing that we actually want to occur is occurring.
Yeah. So this a lot of points that's jumping at me. Give me a second. So. I guess what I'm concerned about in that sense, why we are having this conversation at all, is for means of survival, and that gives reason for us to do this. That gives meaning to our actions as to why we are talking about these things. Whereas when it comes to like two AIs talking together, unless you think about them as a generative adversarial network of some sort, and you ascribe a sense of survival from the outside to it that it does not have for itself, you can say that is meaningful. Hey, I am spending this much money to train this thing to play chess. That is an action is meaningful to me. Yet if they're just having a conversation by themselves, it is meaningless. And in that sense, when we are having this conversation as well, it is because we are interested in these technologies and to increase the capacity of what we can do or what we can become as a species. I mean, I don't want to sound all grand about it, but we are interested in these technologies of communication and what is happening. And I started thinking about like Neuralink and stuff, right? Where that's what, like, Musk is kind of like selling. It's we can communicate without having words. Different people, direct brain to brain communication, no interfaces required. And I see language in many ways. I've noticed, like, we have a tendency to speak with scientific, or I don't know how to put it, but not in magical terms, right? Like, I'm talking about the American Circuit of Intellectuals, you, Peterson. I don't hear you guys speak in, like, magical terms much. Now, that might be because I'm not listening enough, but I would say words are spells, right? And
words are what?
Spells, magic spells, abracadabra. Okay. And I can't really expound on that, unless I move into like scientific language, or what I'm connoting as scientific or academic language. But
I'm happy to go there, by the way. I'm happy to double click on that and dive into that. That's a very interesting realm. But keep going if you want to go.
Yeah. So like magical spells is what I think of language as. And if you go back like the chimp stage, why would they make certain noises, right? Like whoo, whoo, ah, ah, just pointing out, like, noises have directionality, right? Like, and nods mean different things. And so there's a lot of meaning that we don't see unless we call it language. Like, when we were having the earlier discussion about all of these things, you did say, like, it's not language, not to the level of language about like standing up, body, and all those things. But then you say body language, right? And there is a lot of encoding. I'm assuming it's happening from the same centers, I guess, from like the brain as well, just to probably prove it as as a verifiable way of looking at it. But and it's if we consider, like, the lens of humanism, I end where my skin ends, and all of our ethics and politics arise from humanism. The human is a distinct unit, and every human has one equal vote, which essentially means every person has one single soul, which is connected to the right, to the source. I'm assuming everyone has a soul, and so every soul should have a vote, not based on how much money they have, not based on how big they are, but every single container of human being has a soul. And I like to look at things from like a post-human lens. Like I'm made up of cells, and it's a lot of these cells' interests, right? And consciousness is an emergent phenomena, and not arising from like having that soul within us. And I can't transfer my soul into another body and then have it behave the same way. There is the mind and the body, to me, in that sense, being so interwoven together, inseparable, um, has opened up a lot more magic back into me. Like, what do demons mean? And that's where I'm getting at. Like, what does, like, when like Judeo-Christian eschatology says demons, right? Or angels and stuff like that. It's very clear language, and we can like use it to communicate. It's non-scientific, it's non-material,
Mhm.
but we can tell, hey, this is demonic, right? This is demonic presence. Whereas in like as a Hindu brought up in Kerala, India, and that space is cursed because there is this animal deity living there. We are giving humanistic, anthropomorphic traits to that vibe or the energy or the disasters that's happened there, and they are playing around with us in that sense, and they have as much agency
Ah,
as humans do. And to think of that agency as separate from humans into like, not as a singular circle, but I don't know, a field of it. This is where I also kind of go away from like Lacan or like Zizek, because they're all still, I think, humanistic. And that's where I like Deleuze as a philosopher. Deleuze and Guattari's work is very interesting to me. And I think they do good, what do you call it, postmodern stuff, like, legitimate postmodern stuff. And that idea of posthumanism, or like this field of immanence, as they call it, transcendent, immanent, and the field of immanence from which all life gets vitalism from. I think that in many ways like brings back magic into it, like
mm.
thinking magically. It allows me to think magically without having a cognitive dissonance when it comes to language, ideology, and so AI. All of these things is embodied.
Yeah, so let's see. Whew, this is tricky. There's a lot. And it's interesting. I don't think that it was random. Like I feel like there was actually some really interesting through lines that were connecting both what you were just saying and also the larger conversation. I could be just imposing that as a thesis, but nonetheless,
Mhm.
it's my sense of things.
Yeah, I can't connect it back either, but it felt
So
right.
here's a couple of things that were coming up. One was given the fact that the notion, the language, the word ideology was in fact coined in the context of the French Revolution, which is very intensely tied to the history of things like humanism and the relationship between magic and materialism, etc. Right? The French Revolution was a profoundly materialist, desacralizing ideology. There's something about that I think is quite interesting. Like it may be that you cannot separate a term from the conditions of its birth, and that there is something intrinsically tied to a non-magical or anti-magical mode that is associated with the concept itself. Like it's just sort of cannot be otherwise. Maybe it seems plausible to me. Certainly, if I tease down and like start feeling like what are the things that are really going on in the invocation of this term, and it's like all the different ways that it's used. One of the things that I keep finding is exactly one of the points you're making, that there seems to be a deep presumption, axiomatic and largely unconscious, of the ontology that we're living in, and that forecloses on, for example, the category of magic. And many other examples, the category of the sacred as well, I would propose precisely, actually. Perhaps even the notion of the relationship between the field of immanence and the field of transcendence. Like there's a lot of stuff going on here. Okay, that's one-ish. But quite a bit of kinship. I also found myself in that same basic path in relationship to the kind of postmodernist, post-structuralist thinkers. So, for me, Lacan was tastes like poison in the bad sense, put away. Foucault was like, yeah, not bad. I'm down with that. I can play some of that stuff. And then Deleuze was, and particularly it's actually Deleuze and Guattari was good, and then Deleuze was like real good. So kind of the vector I went. And FYI, this guy Manuel de Landa, I also just absolutely adore. Same thing on the kind of the other side of the line, where I found like Benjamin amazing, and I found Althusser pretty good. Gadamer, never got into Gadamer, and always felt like Marcuse was doing something not entirely in the up and up. So, it's interesting how that sort of stuff works and how that creates a whole other set of characteristics. Whoa, okay, hold on. Here's a different frame. So try this on for a second. This is like I'm injecting a whole chunk of stuff, but it feels like we're at a place where that might be actually divergence might be useful. This notion, the term ideology, in addition to being birthed in the context of the French Revolution, there's a pretty good, let's say, theory. Here I'm speaking about people like Marshall McLuhan, media theory, that all of that was birthed in the context of literacy. So when we think something like ideology, when we're using that concept, we are doing so by using a literate mind, the kind of mind that is produced in relationship with writing. And by the way, obviously produces writing. And I'm noticing in the notion of meaningfulness and survival, like the binding of successful navigation of reality. And I would say Deleuze is maybe an example of a precursor or the early version of this. We're clearly in a post-literate context. This digital thing of which AI is perhaps both the crowning result or a primary exemplar of.
Of that post-literary
context, which is producing, in many cases has already produced, for people who are sort of younger than 60, certainly people who are younger than 20, a very, very different context for how they're developing their mind. And therefore, we would need some other way of thinking about thinking, some other style of thinking, probably not even using words in the simplest sense. And I think your pointer here to AI is interesting. In this post-literate environment. So the notion of ideology perhaps is already obsolete because it is strictly bound to the context of literacy, the context of writing, and is not actually functionally well suited to address the context of the digital. That's actually seems plausible to me.
Yeah, and like stuff that immediately came up was I went back to the Pokemon Go thing. If that can be explained as ideology, I mean, in Sizek's case, he used Pokemon Go to explain ideology. Pokemon Go was the entry point to explain the metaphor of ideology. That's what ideology does. And that has to be a very vivid example. That's, for it to be that as a metaphor to explain such an abstract concept like ideology. And where that vivid concept of Pokemon Go is where the future is headed in sense of like AR goggles and stuff like that. Ideology critique does not really quite cut it. Like,
no, it's like trying to use a steam engine to it's like trying to use a steam engine as a metaphor to explain a computer.
Yeah.
It just doesn't have, it's just not strong enough. It doesn't have the possibility space to actually engage properly with the reality it's endeavoring to address. This seems right to me, actually. Like I feel solidity and kind of a groundedness of being able to say, yep, I can use that to navigate reality more effectively.
I think conversation with John Ash might be valuable because I think that's his whole project, or that's how I'm reading it, because there is a lot of vagueness and he is trying to play with these memes to make, you know, if it's post literary, can words, where most, oh, speaking of, I just got a media notification from him, but so I'm gonna take that as a magical cue to go down that path, synchronicity to go down that path, and yeah, I mean, in a world where people are, it's media consumption on like video, TikTok is the primary, entertainment method, or what do you call it? But where most of like, mind space is being sucked into. Perhaps, yeah, words, utterances themselves do not do it. We probably need music to do criticism. We probably need multimedia to do criticism. And on that level, yeah, a lot of interesting things pop
What
up.
would you what do you mean by criticism there? I'm getting the sense when you said that, as I was contemplating it, that word also is not strong enough to deal with what we're trying to do.
So ideology critique, or having gone down that path of like, picking up psychotechnologies from that, inquiry. Uh, for me, critique points out where the points out the invisible, or engaging with those magnifying glances, or like the lens of ideology critique itself gives you a way to look at the other lenses that you have, and that's what I've picked up from like, having done that. So criticism, critique versus criticism. Yeah, I guess I'm using that word to point to putting energy into it. Criticism, critique, so that we can do something. Why do I give you criticism? So that you can do something better.
Mm.
Hmm.
So this notion of like adversarial processing, or the notion of fitness landscape, co-evolutionary relationship, that feels like a really nice way of thinking about it. Like it's a dance. It's more like practicing how to dance. Like if we're learning how to dance together, it's not really critique, right? Because it has to have a fluidity to it. It has to have a flexibility of the intrinsically combinatorially infinite complexity of what's actually happening on both sides of the equation, and yet nonetheless can produce an up gradient. Right? We can actually learn how to dance together and thereby improve each of our individual and our collective capacity to dance. Yeah, I like this. I like this meta metaphor of like obsolescence of a tool. We're talking about critique feels like it's a chisel. Like, well, okay, fine, chisel. You can't really use a chisel to design a circuit board, right? It's not the right kind of tool for that kind of thing. We're doing something different. We need something which has vastly more, like the notion of the way that I've been really feeling into the notion of the word spiritual. I've been doing this rectification of names. I've been holding lots of different words and saying, okay, there's a lot of really cool words that have kind of been thrown into the ash heap of history, like magic. Actually, I don't think any of these things are things that should be tossed out. Let's actually take a look. What's up here? So spiritual to me very much speaks to this notion of infinitesimal relationality, like a field effect, high subtlety, high nuance, high continuity, meaning fluidity with relationship to time, like not the analytic methodology of freezing something and trying to break it apart into its components, but rather how do you actually cultivate quality and growth with a living thing, which actually is alive and therefore infinitely subtle and changing. It's a very different kind of thing. And my sense is critique intrinsically brings an energy of analytic. It brings an energy of death or the broken or the not alive. And there's something else we're trying to actually do. Which, by the way, helps solve. I think you also brought up the question of violence. It helps bring us into a very much more profound relationship with that too.
And so one thing that also popped up in my mind is like, in many ways, an interesting meme that I saw was like it's a bell curve, right? Your intelligence bell curve. And on one side, it's a guy going, yeah, I think magic is cool. My girlfriend does astrology. The guy in the middle goes, magic is bullshit, it's not real. And on the other side, is magic is real, right? And so in many ways, I think that middle intelligence becomes a problem. Because I see like what you would call dumb people or non-educated people having these ideologies as heuristics when it comes to like stuff like spirituality, whether I think there's genuine spirituality, genuine connection to that vitalism of life, whereas being taught the language of death or like the analytics thing of dissecting the frog, you are in many ways taken away from that, and that post thing to that curve is getting back in touch with that you what do you call Ken Wilber calls it like what post rational mysticism or like post rational thought, and coming back in touch with those heuristics, being able to engage with the wisdom that's encoded in these heuristics, which are completely unscientific. They have to talk about flat earth theory to talk about like, their spirituality or whatever. I mean, there's flat earth, there's a lot of uh, connotations, not welcome,
Oh,
but
I had a really, really beautiful experience. I guess about 6 months ago, I got quite sick for like a month. I was sort of bedridden for about a month. And among many other things, one of the things that happened is my cognitive functioning went way down. And it was super interesting, right? So basically, I kind of moved to the left-hand side of your bell curve as I'm facing it. And this gives you an ability to be in. So the reason why I'm saying this is in relation to the notion of flat Earth. If you are thinking from the point of view of the midwit in the top of that bell curve, flat Earth theory sounds really terribly bad, right? It's because it's bad ideology. I'm going to be sort of abusing the term here a little bit, but bear with me for a moment. It's bad ideology when you're operating in an environment where good ideology is what looks like being a functional and successful person, right? Clean, proper, shiny, right? All kinds of like, hey, I'm showing you my ideology, and I've read the books and I understand how to use the right terms. Like, oh, I'm a good person. So somebody providing bad ideology into the middle of that, like, looks terrible. Right? But if you're on the left-hand side of the bell curve, you're not operating in that way at all, right? You don't actually sort of deeply believe in some profound way that the earth is flat. Rather, your way of relating to how to make choices in reality doesn't even use complex mental frameworks to guide choices. Now, from your point of view, you don't need to have. So what you're really saying is, I don't trust the people in the middle of that bell curve, and I'm happy to use a framework that doesn't make any sense. And I mean, obviously, you're not saying it this way. You're saying it in a very deeply intrinsic sense. I so deeply don't trust their college-educated bullshit that I'm happy to use a frame that they actually can't even vaguely digest, because fuck them. And by the way, if it comes toe to toe, I'll whoop their ass. And I'll live in. I'll be able to survive in the world in a way like that. What's that? Hank Williams Jr. song, "Country Boy Will Survive." You do know that song?
No.
It's basically a deeper ethos, right? If you think about it, if I take that bell curve and I flip it like this, vertical, and then I put 1 billion years of biological evolution underneath it, the guy on the left-hand side of that bell curve is saying, "Yeah, you got some fancy stuff going on a little bit higher up on the." On the cognitive functioning piece, real neat. It ain't yet proven to actually deliver on survivability in any meaningful sense, right? We're actually talking about, like you said, relevance, like fitness, function, the ability to actually survive in the world. There's a stack here. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that's pretty obviously part of 1 billion years of deep, deep work on what actually works in surviving and thriving in the world. And the humans who are operating on that left side of the bell curve, they're just really deeply using that to make their choices. And that's a really, really good way to make choices, right? You're leveraging a lot of embedded wisdom earned through the hardest possible school. Yeah. Then you got this kind of thin layer on top of it, which are the smarty pants, who, by the way, our own understanding of history tells us have always been deeply, deeply wrong, reference French Revolution. because they think that they can actually create an ideology, they can create a map that really is actually not just the territory, but better than the territory. And so they think that their model of reality is so fucking sophisticated because they can impress each other with it, that it's actually going to do a better job in navigating complex reality than a billion years of actually robust infrastructure, right? The guys on the right-hand side are having the conversation we're having, saying, yeah, you're right. There's something important about cognition, right? There's something about being able to think about what's happening, and it's not anywhere near as awesome as it likes to pretend it is. Okay.
Like, immediately what comes into mind is like business people making decisions off of their gut, right? Off of their gut, off of their heart, the cognition centers that's, picked up stuff here, versus the midwits using data analytics in stupid ways. I mean, like it's not the lack of data, it's not the lack of any of those things.
Yep.
But there's so many different places or so many different levels of cognition that's being, Procrustean bedded out.
Exactly. So this is very much what I was trying to point to. It's like, hey, there's a narrowing of cognition that we found ourselves in, which is the kind of cognition that trades in, and I'm going to call them ideologies, but here what I mean is trades in the kinds of ideologies that can literally be traded in an ideological marketplace. Like, hey, I am a communist. Here's a book. It's called Communism. I'd like you to become a communist. I'd like to trade this with you. I'd like to convert you to this whole deeply structured construct. Yeah. And there's a lot more to cognition, right? Cognition is vastly larger than that. And making choices in life on the basis of that vastly larger cognition is going to be substantially more effective than trying to build a vertical tower on this narrow bound form of cognition, which has as one of its primary vices hubris, right? Has as a primary vice that it takes itself to be a lot more effective at of dealing with the whole of reality than it even vaguely is. And to your point, the notion that things like spiritual, the notion that things like magic are rejected with the same kind of knee-jerk response that we saw in response to that tweet is a bit of a sign of the same thing. Like, hey, it's just unlikely that the notion of magic is completely absurd. Just unlikely, right? Too many people over too many cultures have pointed to something like this. It's vastly more likely that there's an aspect of reality that we don't really understand, that we can properly point to with the word magic. Our job is to figure out what it is, right? It's probably not the thing where the guy pulls the rabbit out of the hat. Right? That's probably not it.
Which is a very materialistic understanding of magic as well.
Yeah, that's right. And it's probably not like the people who engage in what I'm going to call magical thinking, right? It's probably not, if I light the right sage and kind of wear the right feathers at Burning Man, that I will in fact actually be able to produce changes in reality in the way that I want. But there's definitely something going on in this domain that is worthy of A, the category of being part of reality, and B, therefore, if you want to survive and navigate reality well, consideration in some meaningful way. Okay, that doesn't seem controversial to me. However, our ideologues really have a hard time with that. And by the way, we can go on and on. There's a very large number of pieces of ontology that are of the same type.
This was, I mean, a lot of thought, a lot of framing. And another thing just like popped up in my head. I don't know if you want to delve into it, but I really like that framing of like literary ideology comes with a literary culture. And if you think about language as spells, right? Like we're on video call right now and not on Twitter texting, and you didn't want to do that. And your voice, your presence, I'm getting a better approximation of it, the way we're having a conversation, the way we are sharing energy through our voice, higher pitch sometimes, lower pitch sometimes. All of those things make that change. And words, good writers possibly can put that kind of materiality in their words.
Mhm.
but usually words are as, subtracted away from this kind of energy and like connection to source or the vitalism that's being taken out. And an ideology might not be enough to talk about TikTok, the amount of energy that it's creating, or the way in which how it can change people's minds beyond just the literary word, right? There's music that you already know that brings, you know, relationship that you've already had, and like using that as a metaphor to, put additional vectors too. So a lot
Yeah.
of complex things that so beyond literary capability.
Nice. Yeah. So that notion of learning to dance together, or collaborative evolutionary process. And, in some sense, that this tool, and I'm going to use a chisel, right, or maybe a power drill, somewhere in there, ideology, it kind of has two faces to it in its best, maybe three. One face is the positive, or the one face is we want to get rid of, or find ways to get rid of the things that we actually think are going to be bad. Right?
Mhm.
We want to, an autoimmune system. We want to remove the toxins from our psychology and from our cultural environment. Okay, this is a very nice thing. I appreciate this value. Also, we'd also like to make things better. Right? We'd actually like to find a way to discover the things that we actually value and improve the presencing of that value in our interior and in our shared environment. Also very nice. We'd like that too. There's probably a third piece that has something to do with something very, very, very intrinsic, like self-expression or something like that, or something very having to do with the art, the expression into the world. But let's just hold on to the first two for a moment. So if we accept those as being values, and those are like the values that this older tool is trying to produce in the world, and we use the frame of chisel or steam engine or literacy, right? It's like, okay, great. We really would like to see those values furthered in the world, for sure.
Mhm.
And we're in a new context, so we need a new tool or toolkit, including, by the way, being aware that the concept of metaphor of toolkit is probably itself reductive, but in any event. So let's do that.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to look
Yeah.
different, right? Because we're speaking about, in the current milieu, we have velocity is very high. Right? The velocity of literacy was fucking slow. And I don't mean that in a negative way at all, but it was slow. Right? You read Proust, it took who knows how long, years, for Proust to write these words down, right, and put them in. And then the whole act of publishing it and then distributing it, and me getting it, and then me reading it, is qualitatively different, not just quantitatively. What was it, Stalin? Quantity has a quality all its own. That's qualitatively different than what happens in the velocity of social media. It's also modally different, as you said. Like there's something that happens in the linearity of text that a truly brilliant writer could produce effects that are different. But still, being able to do something in audio, visual, and, by the way, creating 3D representations, and being able to do, I saw somebody produced a really nice graph in relationship to the notion of ideology that located ideology on two different XY coordinate systems, which of course is a higher dimensional representation than one XY coordinate system, and is not the kind of thing that you could convey in linear text particularly well. So there's something about the medium, in this case, a graph, that conveys information or conveys meaning in a fashion that is maybe even impossible or very difficult in text. Particularly when I say impossible, even if you're able to do it skillfully in text, the fact that doing it requires a duration of expression and perception that is definitely different than the duration of writing it in a graph has its own impact, right? So we're dealing with characteristics, velocity, modality, number, right? The number of distinct humans who are able to engage in this interaction. The microcultural fragmentation. Right? So we actually have this consequence of one, all literacy is typically bound by relatively small linguistic groups. And sometimes you'll get somebody who will get a book from a different culture, like the number of books that are translated is much smaller than the number of books that are written in a given language. And the number of people who are able to read many, many different languages is low. But obviously, in the context of where we are now, We one have the imperial dominance of English as a lingua franca, which produced a much larger number of minds that are able to connect. We now have things like Google Translate or AI Translate that's going to effectively solve that problem forever in a particular fashion, right? It solves it to a particular fashion, which just increases the number of distinct frames, deep cultural and or, by the way, microcultural or psychological context they're entering into interaction. You know, the problem of when I say ideology, I'm pointing to something slightly different than when, say, Zizek uses the term ideology. You know, that's a specific problem. Multiply that times everybody and every word, right? You start getting the combinatorial explosion that, you know, literacy tools can't deal with. Okay, cool. We can define a little bit the shape of what we're dealing with. And over here, we can say, okay, we got some new tools that we can also maybe try to deal with it. We can build new psychotechnologies that allow us to navigate this space more appropriately. We can build new actual physical technologies, like we were talking about, maybe what John is trying to work on.
Can I ask what? Sorry, but can I ask what brings your interest to like active inference?
None whatsoever. The Active Inference Institute DM'd me. By the way, I'm Gen X, so I have to I'm translating these words. They're not my natural words. I've never DM'd, I've never slid in anybody's DMs, although I have DM'd people. So the Active Inference Institute DM'd me, inquired as to whether I'd be interested in being on the podcast. I said, I don't actually know what active inference is at all. And I still don't. I have a tiny, tiny degree of ability to engage in, I suppose, inference, and the quality of my experience of talking with that account and in my conversation with Matthew. But it seemed intriguing. It's like, okay, you seem like an interesting chap or a group of people. I can't quite tell. So cool, let's have a call. And then the kind of the hook was, well, we've talked with these other people. So that creates a little bit of a, okay, you're the kind of people who talk to these kind of people. It means it's probably more likely than not that at least it won't be an unpleasant experience. And then Matthew was willing to drop in. So that's it. You got the whole context right there.
I mean, that's kind of what I felt from I didn't see the entirety of it, but I think I saw the first half an hour, 45 minutes of it. And I'm like, so this is not specifically about active inference. This is two guys having a conversation.
Yeah.
And
if they felt, I mean, I assume the Active Inference Institute knows what active inference is. I'm sort of relying on their curation to assume that whatever shtick I've got is worth their audience participating in. So that's effectively the heuristic I was using.
I think definitely, because this technology of that's where John Ash finds interest in it, and that's where I find interest in it. And this is us at Lunar Punk Labs, and we are interested in active inference because it changes machine learning from being a black box to something that's opened up, where you can jump in, pull the threads, and make changes.
Interesting. I should say, by the way, that I have a somewhat similar relationship to the notion of lunar punk. Like I have a I have a somewhat vague relationship to the notion of solar punk, which I think is older. I can obviously do some very simple semantics that lunar punk is in relationship to solar punk, vague like the way moon is relationship to the sun. And I've seen a couple of memes. Here's the funny part. I dig the vibe. I don't really have a sense of what's going on. I dig the vibe of lunar punk.
Yeah. It's solar punk is it paints a materialistic future, right? Like we need the premise singularly what I've understood it to be is we've built all these buildings, and once the global economy collapses, you can't raise it down and start again. You're gonna have to accept all of this and build a new world on top of this hellscape that we've made. And the lunar punk is interested in what's in here and what's in spirit.
Interesting. Well, that feels quite nice, actually.
And I think what we are doing at Punk Labs, and we've just started. I mean, we've been talking for 3 years, working on things, and that thing that we spoke about of our vectors are different, and our towers of Babel are no longer about building a physical structure, right? That's the metaphor. And I think that metaphor has updated to be something like the towers of Babel that we are building is like an ambient computation of our semantic space. I think, or not just semantic space, but like our religious space. And all those divisions will keep happening. But what we are trying to do in many ways is to build that Tower of Babel, though our languages are different. We want to make sure the Tower of Babel is same, but not constrained in the materiality of the language and those geometries there. So yeah. Would you like to talk again about stuff like this? I think I'll prepare a bit.
Yeah, it seems like a really nice conversation. I find myself, well, I haven't been talking to anybody now for quite a while, and I started to have some conversations that seem to be, how do you say it? Like the gradient is nice. We have different vocabulary and different different places that we're coming from, and yet we were, I think, pretty quickly able to come to a place where we were actually having a dialogue. I personally felt like I learned a good amount, and I feel like it felt like it was generative and worth the time. So yes, the answer to the question would be yes. Caveat: my life situation has a pretty high degree of shit that I do. Like, I'm dealing with a lot of stuff, so I don't necessarily have a lot of free time. But I think that's actually getting better. Like, I'm actually clearing more time over the next couple of months. So maybe in 6 weeks, something like that.
Yeah. I mean, nothing particularly. I mean, so are you active anywhere asynchronously? Twitter, yes. Cool. So
I'm more active on Twitter than I should be. Every time I get on Twitter, Twitter clearly tells me unambiguously that I should be spending less time there, and yet I don't listen very well. So I have a question.
It's worth it for the few connections. So
I think I mentioned that when we began the call, that my basic sense was that I didn't want to share this more broadly. Part of me is actually feeling differently. I feel like there was some really good stuff here. Maybe we should think about it. I'll save it, and maybe if over the next few days it feels like it's like right to share it more broadly, we could do that.
I'm with you. Yeah, and there's a lot of stuff I want to like process, and yeah. I mean, if you can send a recording to me as well, I think I'll.
For sure, I'll do that. Yeah. All right.
Thank you, Jordan. I'm humbled to meet with you.
I'm humbled to meet with you as well. Very nice. Bye.
Bye, Jordan. Bye.